When Historic Anthology 7 was being spoiled, I was super excited to start brewing around one of my all-time favorite cards, Bloodbraid Elf. As soon as that preview showed up on my timeline, I just knew that I'd have to showcase this card in a deck that can make use of the classic Jund staple. In Paper Magic, my friends know me as the Cascade guy, but sadly, MTG Arena just hasn't added enough Cascade support to build an entire deck around it. Luckily for us, however, Cascade is just one of 2 keywords that are on Bloodbraid Elf. That's where March of the Machine, the Aftermath comes into play. Samut Vizier of Naktamun is a neat build-around card that encourages you to play hasty creatures and creatures that produce attacking tokens to solve an aggro deck's biggest problem, which is the lack of card draw. She also sits at a convenient mana value of 3, meaning that we can cast her off a Bloodbraid Elf Cascade trigger. With these pieces in place, I whipped up a Gruul Aggro deck that has enough spicy inclusions to unload and refuel over and over again. Our game plan starts at the bottom of our curve, with 3 Hanweir Elves and 3 Elvish Mystics. These dorks can help us ramp into some of our bigger threats at mana value 3 and up. In the 2 mana slot is a trio of Kari Zev Skyship Raiders and Robber of the Riches. Kari Zev summons a Ragavan token whenever she attacks, and Robber can help steal some cards from our opponent to hit them right back with. Mana value 3 is where things get interesting. Of course, we have a playset of Samuts, but we also run a playset of Reckless Stormseekers, which can give haste to some of our slower members of the team. We also run 3 Squee Dubious Monarchs that create goblin tokens whenever they attack, and a pair of Hanweir Garrisons that produce 2 human tokens whenever they attack. Our playset of Bloodbraid Elves sit atop the mana curve, alongside a pair of Questing Beasts to eliminate planeswalkers and negate the protection of the One Ring. Finally, a pair of Delina Wild Mages can produce some fun and wacky results if we clone just the right creature. 21 lands complete this deck, including a cheeky Hanweir Battlement that can meld with the Garrison. So now that you know how the deck works, let's play some games and see just how it stacks up in the historic meta. In our first game, we're on the draw with a really good 7. Going first is preferable for an aggro deck, but we can't complain too much when we just run so much gas. Our opponent plays a mountain, so we play out a Copperline Gorge into a Hanweir Elves. I'm expecting a burn spell to take care of our mana dork, so it surprises me when they just drop a Mind Stone and pass the turn. I've seen colorless artifact combo decks in Historic before, so I imagine we'll be seeing Severance Anvils and Cloud Keys in our near future. We draw a Squee, which we can ramp into to get really aggressive. Squee attacks and creates a 1/1 Goblin Buddy, and then they take the damage, going to 17. Our opponent plays a Mind Maze Tome, then immediately pays the 2 mana to draw a card. Luckily for us, this deck snowballs like crazy when our opponent doesn't interact, so we get to play a Bloodbraid Elf that cascades into a freaking Samut. We full swing to drop our opponent down to 8 life, drawing 3 cards in the process. Our opponent finally reveals their game plan when they cast a Brash Taunter, which deals any damage it takes back to our face. There are plenty of fun and janky brews that mass damage the Goblin to take us out in 1 turn, but our opponent spun their wheels too hard and just couldn't get started quick enough. We drop another Bloodbraid Elf, which brings alongside it a Robber of the Rich, and our opponent scoops the game before they take a massive beatdown. Now, just because this is a Samut deck doesn't mean that we need Samut to get the job done. In game 2, we start on the play with a Mana Dork and a handful of gas, so we drop a Copperline Gorge into Hanweir Elves. Our opponent plays a Jetmir's Garden, which is great news for us because we're free to spill out anything we want from our hand. We ramp out into a Squee and get in for 3 damage, then pass the turn. Our opponent plays a Forest and foretells a card, which means they could be running just about anything. It's Doomskar, it's always Doomskar. Predicting the incoming board wipe, we swing in with the full team, dropping our opponent to 12 life. A Stomping Ground enters the battlefield tapped, and we pass, and our opponent follows up with a Zeotor's Proving Ground. All these triomes mean that we're definitely up against the 5-color domain deck, which means we could see a flashed-in Leyline Binding to remove our Squee. I apply some pressure by casting Lightning Strike on their end step, then on our turn, we full swing again. They have no response, dropping their life total to 3, and a quick little Lightning Strike takes them out for Xaxes. Since we're playing a hasty deck, I want to just quickly ask you to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy what you're watching so far. Your support is completely free and you can choose to unsubscribe at any time. Now let's check out a few other matchups. We're on the play for game 3 with some mana ramp and some decent payoff, so we keep our 7, shocking a Stomping Ground and play the Elvish Mystic. Our opponent plays a Swamp, surprisingly not killing off our Elf. We drop a Rootbound Crag, then attack them for 1 and play the Hanweir Elves. Our opponent plays out a Phyrexian Tower into a Pendragon Besieged, a weird alchemy card that acts kind of like a slow but permanent Pestilence. The enchantment takes out our Elvish Mystic on the end step, so we play a land and cast Bloodbraid Elf, cascading into another Elvish Mystic. Bloodbraid gets in for 3, but it's no match for Liliana the Last Hope, which drops its toughness down to 1 so it can get sniped by the Pendragon Besieged. Luckily, we have our trusty questing beast, which helps us full swing and eliminate the Liliana with its wall of text. Our opponent drops a carrier throw, which immediately gets sacked to the Phyrexian Tower to exile our beast with a soul transfer. The Pendragon also triggers, deleting yet another mana elf from existence. We're starting to flood out when we draw land number 5, but we can still get in with a hasty Reckless Stormseeker, dropping them down to 7 life. With the Lightning Strike in hand, we only need another good attack or two before we have this game wrapped up. Our opponent sacks the Eldrazi Scion to the tower to drop a Phyrexian Obliterator, which spells really bad news for us. We can't attack into the horror without sacrificing our entire mana base, so unless we get really lucky with a good hasty creature, we're gonna end up stuck in place for several turns. Our Mystic gets destroyed yet again, and we top deck yet another land. Oh, we're so close. We can't attack into the Obliterator, so we have to pass the turn, and our opponent plays a Thran Vigor into a Vengeful Strangler, then shrinks our Stormcharge Slasher. We draw into a Squee, which can help us out big time with the go wide strategy that we need to abide by. We full swing, and our opponent blocks the Stormseeker, dropping them to 4 life and forcing us to sack a Goblin and a land. They play out their combo piece in Putrid Goblin, then attack us for 2 with the Strangler, and the Besiege turns our Squee into a 1/1. We draw land number 7, and there's little hope of coming back from our situation. We have to pass, and our opponent full swings at us on their next turn. Squee's going to die anyways, so we chump the Goblin and drop down to 9 life. With no creatures on our side of the battlefield, the Pendragon finally goes away. After so many bad draws this game, we finally get blessed by Richard Garfield himself with an Atarka's Command, which means that we can finally throw a Lightning Strike and an Atarka's Command at their face to take out this mono-black menace. Game 4 puts us on the draw, but we have a Mana Dork into a Samut, which is enough justification to keep the 7. Our opponent starts with a Zhalfirin Void, scrying to the bottom, then they play an Ornithopter into a Stonecoil Servant for X=1. We get out our Lair of the Hydra into Elvish Mystic, and they play a Voltaic Servant which untaps artifacts on their end steps. Seeing all these artifacts in play that can easily block our Samut, we play a tap Stomping Ground and hold up the mana to play Boseiju Who Endures. This ended up being a really good call because they drop a Tempered Steel, which pumps their entire board of artifacts +2/+2. They swing in at us, and we channel the Boseiju to destroy the Tempered Steel. We only take 2 damage instead of what should have been 8, and then they play out an Inquisitive Puppet post-combat, then untap their Servant. On our turn, we play Hanweir Garrison, hoping to untap, play Samut, and then draw a bunch of cards next turn. Then they put in All That Glitters onto their Ornithopter, turning it into a 5/7 flyer that gets untapped every turn, giving it pseudo-vigilance. We don't have any way of beating this Giga Chad Thopter in the rest of our deck list, so while it may look early, we're gonna have to scoop this inevitable loss. This time, we're on the draw with a pretty poor opening hand. 4 of our 7 cards are unplayable if we don't hit a land in our first few draws, so I take the risk by going for a mulligan. This second hand is at least playable, so we bottom the Hanweir Garrison and then keep the rest. Our opponent starts with a tapped Shatterskull, so we get to play our Gorge into a Llanowar Elves. Sadly, our good boy gets stomped, so we play our Forest into a Kari Zev and pass the turn. They play a land into a Wildstorm Caprador, a strange Ikoria common that I've genuinely never seen before. Okay, so I guess we won't throw a Lightning Strike at that thing. On our combat step, we attack with Kari Zev and create a Ragavan token, which our opponent decides to block. In this situation, we can make a cheeky little play with the Atarka's Command, doming them for 3 damage and pumping our board so the Ragavan takes out the Caprador. After that blowout, they play a Bone Crusher Giant, then crack a Fabled Passage to fetch out a Plains. We play our Boseiju on the field and then drop a Bloodbraid Elf, which cascades into a Reckless Stormseeker. We full swing, knowing full well that our opponent will either chump the Ragavan token or sack the Bone Crusher with a block. They choose to take out the Stormseeker, dropping them down to 9 life points, and then take out Kari Zev with a Slaying Fire. On our turn, we top deck a Robber of the Rich, so we drop it in full swing, exiling a Banishing Light that they really must have needed. They play out a Scryland into a Relic Robber to block, but we strike it down before it even gets the chance. And that little play was enough to get our opponent to concede before we got to swing in. We're on the draw again for game 6. Is it just me, or are we on the draw more often than usual in this video? Anyways, ramping into Samut is a great starter with a Robber of the Rich as backup if the elf gets cut down. Our opponent starts with a Hive of the Eye Tyrant, and we play a Gorge into Llanowar Elves. The turn doesn't immediately switch back, which means that, yeah, it's getting destroyed. They play an Otawara, so we fire back with a Gorge into the Robber of the Rich, which gets sniped by the Orcish Bowmasters. I didn't realize that we had more cards in hand than them, so I made a pretty dumb misplay and lost the Robber to the Orcish orc army token. Whoopsie. Our opponent has land troubles when they play a tap castle Locthwain, so we capitalize on their mana screw by playing out Samut. They flash in another Bowmasters in response, and since we don't want to fuel their orc army by drawing extra cards, we decide to pass the turn. They have nothing to do on their turn and pass right back to us, where we swing with an old Samut that won't draw any cards if she gets through. They chump with the army and then cling to dust their Fatal Push to draw an extra card. We fire off a Lightning Strike to remove a Bowmasters, then Besage away their castle Locthwain to stop them from drawing even more cards. We get Thoughtseize, losing a Bloodbraid Elf, and then we play the Reckless Stormseeker, which eats a Make Disappear. Samut still gets in for 2 damage, and they pass their turn away yet again. Either they're playing a really hard go draw deck, or their excess of blue mana is giving them a tough time. We top deck another Stormseeker, which actually resolves this time, and then we get in for 5 damage and draw a card with Samut, then take one from the Bowmasters. Turns out our opponent was holding up an Archmage's Charm, which they cast on our end step to draw 2 cards. They pass their turn yet again, but then flash in a Vendilion Clique during our draw step to disrupt us from playing our best card. They bottom our Bloodbraid Elf, replacing it with a Forest and triggering the Bowmasters yet again. We go to combat, safe to full swing because of Samut's first strike. They throw their army in front of the Slasher, and it tramples over for 3 more damage. Post-combat, they take out the Slasher with a revolted Fatal Push. Unsurprisingly, they pass right back to us, and then Samut swings in for 2 damage. They throw the Clique underneath it, and Samut first strikes to win the exchange. Kari Zev arrives post-combat, and they cling to dust our Lightning Strike to draw a card in response. Kari Zev gets Fatal Pushed, and we're flooding hard on lands. Samut swings in again, and our opponent must be pretty desperate because they chump with their Bowmasters. They cling to dust our Besaju to draw a card yet again, and they finally hit another black source. We get in with Samut again, and then they flash in a V-Click to get rid of the Samut we have in hand. We draw into a Sokenzan to replace it, and that might sneakily come in handy because we've been flooding with so many lands. They chump the Samut, so we drop an Elf and pass the turn. After spinning their wheels for so many turns, they finally find a Sheoldred, then toss out an awful Thoughtseize that only drops their life total. Since we have so many possible draws that could deal the last points of damage that we need, we decide to channel the Sokenzan on the end step to spread out our damage sources. This play pays off when we draw an Atarka's Command, which will deal the last of the damage to their face and prevent Sheoldred's life gain. We prepare to full swing, and Sheoldred blocks the Samut, but Atarka's Command resolves and we take out our opponent with a bunch of tiny little 1/1s. We definitely don't win this matchup on paper, but man, what an exhaustive game. We're on the play with a slower hand than usual, but with enough decent hits on turn 3 and 4, we decide to keep it. Our Stomping Ground enters tapped, and our opponent plays a Swamp with no follow-up. We get out our Rootbound Crag into a Kari Zev, who hopefully will recruit an overpowered monkey when she attacks next turn. Our opponent plays an Acquisitions Expert, so we offer up an Atarka's Command to its ETB trigger. We top deck a Robber of the Rich, which we slam down in full swing. Kari Zev gets a Ragavan token into play, and the Robber exiles a basic Swamp with its attack trigger. Our opponent blocks the Ragavan and drops to 17, which is fine for us since the monkey was about to leave us anyways. On their turn, our opponent drops a Liliana of the Veil, which -2s to make us sacrifice the Robber. We take our revenge on the filthy Planeswalker by attacking Lily directly, and the Ragavan token even gets to hit our opponent for 2 damage. Post-combat, we play out Delina Wild Mage, a fun creature that can get really bonkers if we get lucky with our die rolls. They play another Acquisitions Expert, which rids us of our Robber of the Rich, then they Undercity Plunder us to conjure some random card from our deck into their hand. Surely that won't be a problem, right? On our turn, we full swing at our opponent, triggering Delina and Kari Zev's attack triggers. Delina only rolls a 12, meaning we only get 1 non-legendary copy of Delina tapped and attacking, but every bit of damage does greatly help us. They take 6 damage, and we throw out an Elvish Mystic post-combat. Of course, when we play against a mono-black player and they have 4 swamps, a Phyrexian Obliterator is soon to follow. We could hope and pray that Delina gets lucky 4 or 5 times in a row, but we decide to play it safe by dropping Robber of the Rich and passing the turn. That play ended up being a massive mistake because they play a Path of Peril, taking out most of our board. All we can do now is play out our Llanowar Elves and just hope for something good on our next draw step. Our opponent plays their Conjured Reckless Stormseeker and another mana dork. We have to hold back for another turn, so they drop a Jinji and hey, remember that Stormseeker that I said wouldn't be a problem earlier? Well, it's a big problem now because now they can start dishing out some flying dragon beats. They hold off on an attack for another turn, and surprise surprise, we draw another land. They drop Jinji number 2, which dies to the legend rule and reanimates our questing beast from our graveyard. They give it trample and +2/+0, and we take the 6 damage. Our last hope is an insanely lucky run with Delina's die roll, so we cross our fingers and full swing. We roll a 19. Okay, that's just what we need. We roll 19 again. Oh my god, I think we're getting there. All we need is well, that isn't nearly enough. We get the GGs and scoop up the game just 2 die rolls short of a victory. So, since we run both Hanweir Garrison and Hanweir Battlements, you must be wondering, did you ever get to meld them together? Well, during one game that I wasn't even recording, that janky dream actually became a reality. I was playing against a mono-white aggro deck when I flooded out on lands really bad, so I just thought, why not just try it for the hell of it? Well, sure enough, the trigger resolved, and we had a jumbo 7/4 hasty trampler on our side of the field. Our opponent didn't even know what hit them, and our brand new Eldrazi army was enough to get them to concede. Overall, in the games I presented in this video, we ended up with a 5-2 record, but there's a little emphasis on games I presented. I don't normally like to cherry pick the matches I showcase for these videos, but I didn't have much of a choice this time because of all the mono-black Sheoldred decks that I matched up against. The combo of Orcish Bowmasters, Sheoldred the Apocalypse, and the One Ring are an inevitable force that you're bound to run into if you want to play Historic these days. Between Sheoldred's near insurmountable 5 toughness, the One Ring's insane card draw, and the negation of any downside when the Ring and Sheoldred are in play together, this deck stands no chance of beating the Money Pile deck. When so many matches were lost to the same combo over and over again, I didn't want to bog down this video by showing the same matchup over and over and over again. As per usual, it's time to look back at this deck and criticize my deck building decisions. Ramping into Samut on turn 2 is pretty powerful, but it comes at the cost of running so many mana dorks that really don't do anything in the late game. The number of games that we flooded on lands and drew into multiple dead cards in a row is staggering, so in retrospect, I would exchange these dorks for more low-curve hasty creatures. Phoenix Chicks would make for good evasive threats with recursion, and although I filmed these games before Wilds of Eldraine spoiler season, the new Charming Scoundrel would help with either card filtering, ramping, or pumping. Oh well, at least this deck was a blast to play either way. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. On your way out, it would be fantastic if you could tap that like button and the subscribe button if you'd like to see more of these videos in the future. You can also find me on social media at JayoticMTG to keep up with my random thoughts and channel updates. Until next time, take care.